In all his years of television, Steve Harvey had never stopped mid-sentence because of 2 words spoken by a woman in the audience. He'd handled hecklers, unexpected answers, wardrobe malfunctions, and every conceivable disruption that live television could throw at him. But he'd never heard someone speak with such quiet certainty, such trembling hope, such desperate conviction that he forgot entirely what question he'd been asking, what game they'd been playing, what show he was supposed to be hosting. The woman was elderly, somewhere in her 70s, though grief and hard living had perhaps added years that didn't belong to her. She sat in the 5th row, her hands folded in her lap with the particular stillness of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to not draw attention to herself or her needs. She wore a simple floral dress, the kind you might find at a church thrift store, pressed carefully but faded from too many washings. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes, those eyes, held something that made Steve's next joke die in his throat before he could deliver it. He'd been in the middle of introducing the next family, building up the energy in the room the way he always did, when this woman had stood up slowly, gripping the seat in front of her for balance, and spoken in a voice that somehow carried across the entire studio, despite being barely above a whisper. "Mr. Harvey," she'd said. "I found him." 3 words, simple, direct, and completely shattering in their implication. The studio didn't explode into chatter or confusion. Instead, it fell into the kind of silence that has texture and weight, that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Even the production crew, who'd seen everything in their years of working live television, went still. The cameras kept rolling because no one had told them to stop. And sometimes the most important moments get captured simply because the machinery doesn't know it should pause. Steve stood at his mark, his microphone halfway to his mouth, his face cycling through expressions, confusion, then curiosity, then something that looked like recognition, as if some part of him understood before his conscious mind caught up, that he was about to witness something that transcended game shows and points and the careful choreography of entertainment. "Ma'am?" he said, and his voice had shifted into that gentle register he used when he sensed fragility, when he understood that whatever was happening required his full humanity, not his professional persona. "What did you say?" The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't sit back down. She stayed standing, one hand still gripping the seat in front of her, the other now pressed against her chest as if trying to hold her heart inside her body. "I found him," she repeated, and this time her voice broke over the words. "After 43 years. I found my grandson, and he's here, right here in this studio." To understand what was about to happen in that studio, you have to go back 43 years, to a humid summer night in 1981, when Dorothy Hayes' daughter gave birth to a baby boy in a county hospital in rural Alabama, then disappeared from the maternity ward 8 hours later, leaving behind only a newborn, wrapped in a hospital blanket, and a note that said simply, "I can't. Please forgive me. Tell him I loved him." Dorothy had been 56 that summer, already raising her daughter's 2 older children after her husband had died 3 years prior. She'd worked double shifts at a textile mill, her hands moving across fabric in the dark hours before dawn, returning home to cook dinner and help with homework, and collapse into bed only to do it all again. When the hospital called to say her daughter was gone and the baby needed somewhere to go, Dorothy had rushed there with her heart breaking and her arms ready, determined that this child, her grandson, her blood would not be lost to the system. But the state had other ideas. A grandmother in her late 50s, already caring for 2 children, working minimum wage, living in a 2-bedroom rental they deemed her insufficient. The baby, they said, needed a proper home, a younger family, parents who could provide stability and opportunity. They'd taken him from the hospital before Dorothy could even hold him, placed him in emergency foster care, then, with an adoptive family whose names were sealed by court order, whose location was protected by laws designed to create clean breaks and fresh starts. Dorothy had fought. She'd hired a lawyer she couldn't afford, attended court hearings in clothes she'd borrowed, pleaded with judges and social workers and anyone who would listen. But the system had already decided, and the system with its forms and procedures and best intentions didn't account for a grandmother's love, for the particular bond between blood and blood, for the way some absences create wounds that never quite close. The adoption was finalized when the baby was 4 months old. Dorothy was given no information except that he'd gone to a good family out of state, that he'd have opportunities she couldn't provide, that she should find peace in knowing he'd be cared for. But peace had been impossible. For 43 years, she'd carried the weight of him, this child she'd never held, this grandson she'd been deemed unworthy to raise, this ghost who lived somewhere in the world with her daughter's eyes and her husband's smile, and no idea that someone had been searching for him his entire life. She'd never stopped looking. Even as the years stretched on, even as her other grandchildren grew up and had children of their own, even as her body aged and her hope dimmed, she'd kept searching. She'd registered with every reunion database, every DNA testing service, every adoption registry that existed. She'd written letters to the state, to lawyers, to anyone who might help. And 3 months ago, the miracle had happened. A DNA match. A notification on her phone from one of those ancestry websites where people spit into tubes trying to find their ethnic percentages and maybe, just maybe, the family they'd lost. The match showed a grandson 43 years old, living in California, listed simply as David M. Dorothy had stared at that notification for 20 minutes, unable to breathe, unable to believe that the search that had defined her entire adult life might finally be ending. She'd reached out through the website's messaging system, had waited 3 agonizing days for a response, and when it came, when David M. had written back saying he'd been adopted as an infant from Alabama, that he'd always wondered about his birth family, that he'd love to connect, Dorothy had wept for hours, decades of grief pouring out all at once. They'd been messaging for weeks, planning to meet, building a relationship through screens and keyboards and the careful exchange of life stories. David had told her about his adoptive parents who'd loved him well, about his career as a social worker helping foster children, about how he'd always felt called to that work without understanding why. Dorothy had told him about his mother, about the 2 older siblings he'd never known he had, about a family that had been incomplete for 4 decades, waiting for him to come home. And then, impossibly, they'd both been selected to be in the studio audience for Family Feud. Dorothy through a church group lottery, David through his workplace team-building event. Neither had mentioned it to the other in their messages. Neither had known. Until Dorothy had walked into that studio and seen him sitting 3 rows ahead, and her heart had recognized what her mind had only known through photographs and DNA percentages, and faith that borders on delusion. Steve Harvey set his cards down on the podium with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. The studio had gone from entertainment space to something else entirely. The air felt different, charged with anticipation and fear and hope all tangled together. Production assistants had frozen in the aisles. Camera operators had instinctively zoomed in, not knowing exactly what they were capturing but understanding that it mattered. "Ma'am," Steve said carefully, moving away from his mark, walking toward the 5th row where Dorothy stood trembling. "Are you telling me that your grandson, the one you've been searching for, is here? In this studio? Right now?" Dorothy nodded, and tears were streaming down her face now, no longer held back by the decades of practice at staying small, staying quiet, staying invisible. "Row 2, she whispered, pointing with a shaking hand. "The man in the blue shirt. That's him. That's David. That's my baby." Every head in the studio turned toward row 2. The cameras swiveled, searching, finding a man in his early 40s sitting perfectly still, his face frozen in an expression that cycled between confusion and dawning recognition and something that looked like terror. David Martinez, that was the name he'd grown up with. The name his adoptive parents had given him, had gone completely white, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat. "Sir," Steve said, his voice cutting through the silence, "do you know this woman?" David's mouth opened, closed, opened again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, cracking with emotion. "We've been messaging. For 3 months. Planning to meet. But I didn't know." He looked at Dorothy, really looked at her for the first time, and something broke open in his face. "Grandma?" The word, that single word, spoken for the first time in 43 years, shattered the last remaining composure in the studio. The audience erupted in gasps and sobs, hands flying to mouths, strangers reaching for each other, the collective emotional release of 300 people who'd just witnessed the impossible. Steve had his hand pressed against his chest, his eyes squeezed shut, his jaw clenching as he fought to maintain control. When he opened his eyes, they were swimming with tears, and he didn't try to hide them or blink them away. He walked down from the stage, moved through the aisle toward row 2, and when he reached David, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stand up, son," Steve said gently. "Your grandmother is waiting." David rose on legs that seemed barely able to hold him. He was tall, 6 feet at least, with dark hair graying at the temples, and eyes that were unmistakably his grandmother's eyes. The same shape, the same depth, the genetic echo that travels through generations, regardless of separation or circumstance. He turned to face Dorothy, and the 3 rows between them might as well have been an ocean, a chasm, an impossible distance that somehow needed to be crossed. Dorothy had started moving toward him, not waiting for permission, not caring about blocking aisles or disrupting the show or any of the social conventions that had governed her quiet life. She was shuffling toward him with the determination of someone who'd waited 43 years and couldn't wait one more second, her hands outstretched, her face a mask of joy and grief and disbelief, all happening simultaneously. Steve stepped aside, creating space, and the audience members between Dorothy and David pressed themselves back into their seats, creating a path, bearing witness to something they understood instinctively was sacred. The cameras followed Dorothy's progress every step, every labored breath, every moment of this journey that had started 4 decades ago in a hospital, and was finally, impossibly, ending here under the bright lights of a game show stage. When Dorothy reached David, she stopped just inches away from him, her hands still outstretched, but not quite touching, as if she was afraid that contact might prove he was an illusion, a dream, something her desperate mind had conjured. Her voice when she spoke was barely a whisper, but the microphones caught every syllable. "I held your mother's hand when she gave birth to you," she said, the words tumbling out like a confession, like a prayer, like testimony she'd been waiting 4 decades to deliver. "I saw you take your first breath. You had a full head of dark hair and the smallest fingers I'd ever seen. And then they took you away before I could hold you, before I could tell you that you were wanted, that you were loved, that I would have given anything to keep you." David's face crumpled. This man in his 40s, this social worker who'd built a career helping reunite families, who'd counseled countless children through trauma and loss, stood there and sobbed like a child himself, all his professional composure dissolving under the weight of a truth he'd always known, but never quite believed. That somewhere out there, someone had been searching for him all along. "I thought," he choked out between sobs, "I thought nobody wanted me. My parents, my adoptive parents, they were amazing. They loved me. But I always wondered why my birth family gave me up. I thought I wasn't enough. I thought—" "No," Dorothy interrupted, and there was a fierceness in her voice now, a strength that transcended her years and her frailty. "No, baby. You were everything. You were wanted so much it broke me when they took you. I fought for you. I lost, but I fought. And I never stopped looking. Not for one day in 43 years did I stop looking for you." David reached for her then, and Dorothy fell into his arms, and the studio watched as grandmother and grandson held each other for the first time, making up for 4 decades of missed embraces in this single, desperate clutching that looked like drowning and salvation happening simultaneously. Steve Harvey had backed away to give them space, but he was openly weeping now, not bothering to hide it, not trying to maintain professional distance. His shoulders shook with sobs, and when a production assistant offered him a tissue, he waved it away, let the tears fall unchecked, understanding that some moments require you to be fully human, to surrender to emotion, to witness without performing. The embrace lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only a minute, maybe 2. When Dorothy and David finally pulled apart enough to see each other's faces, they were both laughing through their tears, that particular sound that happens when grief and joy occupy the same space, and you don't know whether to celebrate or mourn, so you do both at once. "You look like her," Dorothy said, her hands coming up to cup David's face, studying his features with the intensity of someone memorizing something precious. "You have your mother's nose, your grandfather's chin. You have our eyes, the haze eyes, we call them. I've been looking into those eyes my whole life. In the mirror, in my children, in your cousins, and here they are. Here you are." David was shaking his head in wonder. "I can't believe we were both here, both of us, in the same studio, and we didn't even know. What are the odds? What? That's God, Dorothy said with absolute certainty. That's not coincidence, baby. That's divine intervention. That's 43 years of prayers being answered in the most impossible way. Steve had composed himself enough to speak, though his voice was still thick with emotion. Folks, he said, addressing the studio. The cameras, everyone watching. I don't know what we were supposed to be doing today. I don't remember what show we were taping. But I know, with everything in me, that this is what we're supposed to be doing right now. This is what matters. He turned to Dorothy and David, who were still holding each other, Dorothy's head barely reaching David's shoulder, both of them swaying slightly, as if to music only they could hear. How long have you been searching? Steve asked Dorothy gently. 43 years, 2 months, and 6 days, she answered without hesitation. And the specificity of it, the fact that she'd been counting, that every single day had been marked by his absence, landed like a physical blow in the studio. Steve's hand came to his mouth again, and he had to take a moment before he could continue. And David, when did you start looking for your birth family? David pulled back slightly from his grandmother but kept one arm around her shoulders, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go completely. I registered my DNA 3 years ago, he said. But I've wondered my whole life. My adoptive parents always told me my birth mother was young, that she couldn't take care of me, that the decision was made out of love. But they didn't know about. He looked at Dorothy, his voice breaking again. About you. About someone fighting for me. About someone searching. I left messages everywhere, Dorothy said. Every registry, every database. I didn't have money for private investigators or fancy lawyers, but I left my name everywhere I could think of. I wanted you to be able to find me, if you ever looked. I wanted you to know you weren't forgotten. The audience was transfixed, many of them recording on their phones despite the studio's policy against it, understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended rules and regulations. This was history being made, a family being reunited, 43 years of separation being bridged in the most unlikely of places. Steve gestured toward the stage. Would you both come up here with me? I think we need to honor this moment properly. Dorothy and David made their way to the stage together, moving as one unit, unwilling to separate even for the few steps required to navigate the aisle. When they reached the stage, Steve positioned them center stage, under the brightest lights, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, these two people who'd been searching in darkness for 4 decades, finally standing together in the light. I want everyone here to understand something, Steve said, his voice finding its strength again, carrying to every corner of the studio. What we just witnessed, that wasn't luck. That wasn't coincidence. That was perseverance. That was a grandmother who refused to give up. That was a grandson who kept searching even when he didn't know exactly what he was searching for. That was love that survived 4 decades of separation, that outlasted laws and distance and every circumstance that tried to keep them apart. He turned to Dorothy. Ma'am, you said you fought for him. Tell us about that fight. Dorothy's hand found David's again, gripping it like an anchor, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of testimony, of truth that had been held too long in silence. I went to court 4 times, she said, and the studio was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the cameras, the gentle whoosh of the ventilation system. I wore my best dress, the same one I wore to my husband's funeral, and I sat in front of judges and social workers and I begged. I told them I could work more hours, that I'd find a bigger place, that blood should matter, that family should matter. Her voice cracked and David squeezed her hand, giving her strength to continue. But they had papers, reports. They said I was too old, too poor, too overwhelmed with the 2 children I already had. They said David deserved better than what I could give him. And maybe tears streamed down her face. Maybe they were right about some of it. I was struggling. I was tired, but I loved him. God knows I loved him, and I would have found a way. Steve knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Dorothy's eye level, and the gesture was so gentle, so deliberately honoring, that several audience members let out soft sobs. You did everything you could, Steve said, and it wasn't a question but an affirmation, a benediction. Permission for her to release the guilt she'd been carrying. You fought for him. You lost, but not because you didn't love him enough. You lost because the system with all its rules and procedures couldn't measure love. Couldn't quantify what it means for a grandmother to refuse to give up. Dorothy nodded, her free hand coming up to wipe at her eyes. "I used to dream about him," she whispered. "Every birthday, I'd light a candle and wonder what he looked like, if he was happy, if his parents were good to him. I'd imagine him growing up, first day of school, learning to ride a bike, graduating, all these milestones I'd never see. And I'd pray. Lord, I prayed so hard. I prayed he was loved. I prayed he was safe. I prayed that someday, somehow, I'd get to tell him that he wasn't abandoned, that someone wanted him, that someone never stopped wanting him." David had pulled his grandmother close again, his tall frame bent to accommodate her smaller one, and he was crying into her shoulder. 43 years of wondering finally answered. 43 years of questions finally resolved. "My parents were good to me," he said, his voice muffled but clear enough for the microphones to catch. "They loved me completely. They never made me feel like I was anything other than their son. But there was always this empty space, this question mark. And now," he pulled back to look at Dorothy's face. "Now I understand. I wasn't unwanted. I was fought for. I was searched for. I was loved before I could even remember." Steve stood, giving them space, and turned to address the audience. But before he could speak, Dorothy touched his arm, stopping him. "There's something else," she said, and her voice carried a new urgency. "Something I need David to know." Steve nodded, stepped back, creating room for whatever truth needed to be spoken. Dorothy reached into the small purse she'd been carrying, her hands shaking as she pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age, the edges soft from decades of handling. "Your mother," she said to David. "She didn't just disappear. She left this, for you. The hospital gave it to me, and I've been carrying it for 43 years, waiting to give it to you." David's hands trembled as he took the envelope, and the camera zoomed in, capturing the faded handwriting on the front. "For my baby boy. When he's old enough to understand." The studio held its breath. Steve stood perfectly still, understanding that this moment, this sacred exchange needed no commentary, no facilitation, just space and silence and witness. David opened the envelope carefully, as if it might disintegrate in his hands, and pulled out a single piece of hospital stationery covered in cramped, desperate handwriting. His eyes scanned the page, and as he read, his face cycled through every emotion, pain, understanding, grief, and finally, a kind of peace. "She was 17, he said aloud, reading from the letter. "She was terrified. She thought giving me up was the only way to give me a chance at a better life." She wrote, his voice broke, and he had to pause, swallow, breathe. She wrote, "I love you more than I love myself, and that's why I can't keep you. Because love sometimes means letting go when you're not enough." Dorothy's shoulders shook with sobs. "She was enough," she said fiercely. "She was young and scared, but she was enough. I would have helped her. We would have made it work. But she left before I could tell her that. She left, and I never saw her again." Steve's expression shifted to something like alarm. She's gone?" Dorothy nodded. 15 years ago. Drug overdose. She never got over the guilt of leaving him. She spiraled, and I couldn't save her. But I thought if I could find him, if I could tell him she loved him, that she never stopped loving him, maybe her life wouldn't have been for nothing." The grief in the studio was palpable now. Layers upon layers of loss and regret, and the complicated mathematics of love that sometimes looks like abandonment, sacrifice that sometimes looks like failure, strength that sometimes looks like surrender. David was crying openly, holding his mother's letter against his chest. "I wish I could tell her I understand," he whispered. "I wish I could tell her I'm okay, that I had a good life, that her decision, it gave me everything. Parents who loved me, opportunities, education, a career helping kids like she was, kids who are scared and young and making impossible choices." Steve moved closer, placed his hands on both Dorothy's and David's shoulders, creating a connection, a circuit of understanding and grief and hard-won peace. "She knows," Steve said with quiet conviction. "Wherever she is, she knows. Because you're standing here with the grandmother who never stopped fighting for you. You're living proof that love doesn't end, that family doesn't disappear, that some bonds are stronger than separation or time or every circumstance that tries to break them. He paused, looking between them. And David, your whole life, your career helping foster children, that's her legacy. That's her love still working in the world. You're helping kids make the same impossible choices she made, and you're doing it with compassion because you understand. Because you lived it. David nodded slowly, something settling in his expression, some piece of his identity clicking into place. I always wondered why I was drawn to that work, he said. Why I couldn't walk away from the hard cases, the kids everyone else gave up on. It's because I was one of them. And someone, somewhere, didn't give up on me. Dorothy reached up to touch his face again. That gesture of a grandmother learning her grandson for the first time, memorizing features she'd missed watching develop over 43 years. You're everything I prayed you'd be, she said. Good and kind and strong. Your mother would be so proud. I'm so proud. The studio lights seemed to soften somehow. Or maybe it was just the tears in everyone's eyes creating halos, creating the illusion of something holy happening in this most unlikely of places. Steve had stepped back now, giving them space. But his face was wet with tears, and his hand was pressed against his heart, and in his expression was the recognition that he'd just facilitated something that transcended entertainment, that touched the very core of what it means to be human, to search, to find, to finally come home. The episode never aired in its intended form. The network made a decision that would have been unthinkable in any other circumstance. They scrapped the planned show entirely and built an hour-long special around Dorothy and David's reunion. It aired on a Sunday evening in March, and over 100 million people watched a grandmother and grandson find each other under the bright lights of a game show stage. But numbers, as always, tell only the smallest fraction of the story. They can't measure the adoption agencies that were flooded with calls from birth families wanting to register their information, wanting to make themselves findable, wanting to leave a trail for children who might someday search. They can't quantify the grandparents who'd been told to move on, to forget, to accept that their grandchildren were lost to them, who suddenly found the courage to keep looking. They can't count the adoptees who submitted their DNA that night, hoping for their own miracle, their own impossible reunion. Dorothy and David spent the following week in Los Angeles, appearing on talk shows and news programs, telling their story over and over, never tiring of it, because each telling was another way to honor the 43 years of separation, another way to say that persistence matters, that love outlasts law, that family finds a way. But the real story happened in the quiet moments. In the hotel room where Dorothy met David's wife and 2 teenage children, her great-grandchildren, for the first time. In the restaurant where David's adoptive parents flew in to meet Dorothy and thank her for never giving up on the boy who'd become their son. In the late-night phone calls where Dorothy and David talked for hours, filling in 4 decades of blank space with stories and memories and the slow construction of a relationship that should have been built from birth, but was being built now, stronger for having survived the impossible. Steve Harvey stayed connected. He attended David's family reunion that summer in Alabama, where Dorothy introduced her grandson to 47 relatives he'd never known existed, aunts and uncles and cousins, and the siblings who'd grown up without him. Steve helped establish a foundation in Dorothy and David's names, supporting grandparents fighting for custody, funding legal aid for families navigating the adoption system, creating bridges for reunification when laws and policies built walls. The letter from David's mother was framed and hangs in David's office now, where he still works as a social worker. He reads it to young mothers facing impossible choices, helping them understand that love can look like letting go, that sacrifice doesn't mean abandonment, that their stories matter even when they end in separation. And when they cry, when these young mothers break down under the weight of decisions no teenager should have to make, David holds them the way Dorothy held him that day in the studio. With the tenderness of someone who knows what it costs to be loved that much, to be fought for that hard, to be found after being lost. Dorothy lived 3 more years after the reunion. 3 years of Sunday dinners with David's family, of birthday parties for great-grandchildren, of finally being the grandmother she'd been prevented from being for 4 decades. When she died peacefully in her sleep at 79, David was holding her hand, and her last words were, "I found you. I found you." As if the greatest accomplishment of her entire life was those 3 months of searching that ended on a game show stage. As if everything else had been prologue to that moment of recognition and reunion. At her funeral, David spoke about persistence as an act of faith, about love that refuses to accept loss, about a grandmother who taught him that being family isn't about biology or law or who raises you. It's about who refuses to forget you, who keeps searching, who believes against all evidence that someday, somehow, you'll find your way home. The clip of their reunion still circulates online, shared by adoption support groups and family reunification organizations, and people who just need to be reminded that impossible things sometimes happen. That prayers get answered in game show studios. That grandmothers who fight for 43 years sometimes win. That love stubborn, persistent, refusing to quit love can bridge any distance, survive any separation, outlast any circumstance that tries to diminish it. Because television doesn't just entertain. Sometimes, when a grandmother stands up and says, "I found him," it reminds us that we're all searching for something. Connection, family, belonging. The proof that we matter to someone. That someone somewhere has been looking for us all along. And sometimes, against all odds, we find it. If this story touched your heart, don't just leave quietly, tell us in the comments below. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Was it a word, a moment, or something it reminded you of in your own life? We read every single message because your stories keep this space alive. And if you believe the world still needs moments like this, hit subscribe, join our family, and help us keep remembering the stories that deserve to be told. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost, and where your story might be the next one we tell.